event. My name, for those of you who I don't know, is Jesse Kanson-Benenov. I'm the Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. I'm very excited to welcome everyone to this conversation about accessory dwelling units, the success in Arlington, and an opportunity for us as pro-housing organizers and activists in the state to learn from the great success of Arlington. I want to say at the beginning, as folks know, Representative Andy Vargas is scheduled to appear. My understanding is that he is still in session in the House. The Republican caucus is raising some issues with the House vaccine mandate, so he needs to be focused on that this evening. If they end with enough time for him to join us, he will jump on. But I just wanted to let folks know that that's why Representative Vargas is not here and may not be able to join us this evening. We will schedule a follow-up conversation with him and invite everyone to learn more about his bill, H 1448, a zoning reform that includes accessory dwelling units by right around the state. Abundant Housing Massachusetts is a new statewide pro-housing organization. We believe that Massachusetts is for everyone and that every community in Massachusetts should be open and welcoming to all people, regardless of race or income, age, ability, or any other life experience. And we're doing that by trying to build a statewide network of grassroots pro-housing organizations. We are a membership organization. I know many of you who are on this call are already members. For those of you who were invited and are not yet members, if you appreciate this event and are focused on building an abundance of housing across the state of Massachusetts, would encourage you to join us as a member. You can join at our website, abundanthousingma.org. I'm excited for this conversation tonight because we at Abundant Housing believe that accessory dwelling units are a really important tool for communities around Massachusetts to help address the housing shortage in our state, to help build more housing opportunity and equity in their communities. It's one tool in a broader toolkit for housing production, housing abundance, and housing equity. And we think that all communities should adopt legislation or bylaws similar to the bylaw adopted earlier this year in Arlington. That's the focus of our conversation tonight. I am going to take for granted that if you are registered for this webinar, that you have some understanding of what an accessory dwelling unit is. Accessory dwelling units, ADUs, accessory homes, granny flats, in-law flats, take on different terminology, but they're all really referring to the same thing. That's an accessory use, a residential use on existing residential site. We'll maybe get a little bit into how the Arlington bylaw differs from things we've seen in other communities around the state recently. But that's our focus for tonight. I'm going to have a short conversation with three different conversations, members of Equitable Arlington, the organization, which is a new member of Abundant Housing Massachusetts, but has existed in their own right and was the force behind passing the strong ADU bylaw in the town of Arlington. Joining us tonight are Phil Tedesco, Barbara Thornton, and Steve Revelak. Both are all members of Equitable Arlington. And I'm going to start the conversation tonight with Phil Tedesco. So Phil, you can go ahead and turn on your video and audio. Thank you. So Phil, we're going to start with you to talk about the sort of background of how did we get to the point where Arlington passed this strong ADU bylaw, and then a little bit in terms of sort of the legal approach, or how did you craft the ordinance and what's entailed in it today. So I'm wondering if you can start with a brief background and sort of the past history around ADUs, just to sort of set the stage. I'm going to step away for just a moment because I realize I've left the door open to my office, and my toddler is about to come home any minute. So why don't you go ahead, and I will be right back. I apologize.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this wasn't the first effort in Arlington to pass ADUs. The most recently in 2019 town meeting, there was a proposed bylaw that failed just short. That was pre-housing choice, so failed just short of the 2/3 majority. There was another effort in 2020 that the redevelopment board felt needed more work before recommending it to town meeting. And there had been at least one effort several years in the past. And I believe the ARB and the Department of Planning and Community Development were intending or at least very interested in proposing an ADU bylaw again for this town meeting when we got involved.
Can you define what ARB is for those who don't know?
Oh, sorry. It's the Arlington Redevelopment Board, which is the relevant board in town that would have jurisdiction over the zoning bylaw and recommend changes, among other things, recommend changes to the bylaw to town meeting. Great.
So I want to dig in a little bit into sort of what's in the bylaw that passed at town meeting earlier this year, and sort of how did some of the challenges or pushback that you experienced or others experienced in the past inform what went into the bylaw as it was drafted for this town meeting?
Sure. So just in putting the bylaw together, we started with trying to understand both what do other bylaws in Massachusetts look like, looking a little more broadly, what are in other states do ADU bylaws look like, and what can we learn from sort of prior research that's been done. Sort of there are a number of organizations, and most particularly the AARP had several really helpful guides and studies on accessory dwelling units and what works and what doesn't. So we looked at all of those things to figure out what does a good and successful ADU bylaw look like, and then looking around the Commonwealth, thinking about what are some of the restraints that we might face. Just because that is sort of a natural baseline that people will be comparing what we try to do, against.
Mm-hmm. So when we talked before this, you talked a little bit about sort of 12 key issues that you wanted to highlight or to include in this bylaw. Can you go through some of those and talk specifically about what are some of the key elements that you included?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So in doing that, kind of, background, review and research, we sort of came up with basically an issues list of, here are things we need to address in the bylaw one way or the other. And so one of them, for example, is parking. Is there going to be off-street parking required? Another is, are you going to allow there to be new construction for the ADU? Can you expand your house or build a detached ADU, or are you restricted to the existing house as it currently exists? Where in town can you do ADUs? Is it anywhere or only in certain limited districts? Should we have our income or rent restriction? Should it be limited to family members? And so what we did was sort of look at the the sort of past attempts in Arlington and around the state, and we sort of settled on and the other materials and realized that the more sort of restrictions you put on, they're going to restrict it and limit the success in one of two ways. One, by just making it illegal on more lots. So it's already something that you can't just like willy-nilly go do. There's still all sorts of dimensional requirements for zoning. And the other is, even if it's legal, technically speaking, it may provide like a big disincentive for an owner, like a normal person, to actually want to do this. And the other kind of guiding thing we had in our minds was that this was really sensitive because Amy Dane has a really great survey of ADUs in Massachusetts, and finds that even in the most successful places, you only get single digits per year of units. So if you're losing any number of units, it has a dramatic effect on the overall number that will be produced. And you see from that, you really need to have something that is as permissive as possible within the whatever constraints you're going to have. So we proposed no additional parking. The reason for that, we felt obviously this was an objection that came up a lot that people were voicing. Arlington does not allow on-street parking. But in any case, often we felt like this is up to the owner of the property to figure out if the person the resident will have a car and where they're going to park it. And it's not for zoning to figure out where they can park their car. We also, in terms of allowing new construction, one common thing is you can only build within the existing house. You have to convert existing space, but you can't expand space. And we felt, first of all, that's really not going to work for a lot of people. But also, like, why? We felt like a principle that we can stand behind that's also better policy is if you can build a spare bedroom, you can bump out your house for an ADU, and shouldn't be treated any differently. I should say as background too, this is part of this is all part of the advancing the sort of planning goals of the community. And so we at the beginning of the process and throughout, had the great benefit of working with our, Department of Planning and Community Development and really excellent director, Jenny Raitt, and get her advice and insights on, on these points and how we were thinking about it and the direction we were trying to go.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I know Jenny is here on the webinar tonight. So just want to recognize that I know she was a great resource to you all. One question around sometimes communities approach ADUs implementing things like income or rent restrictions. How did that enter the conversation? Both in terms of ultimate decisions around, whether to place any sorts of restrictions on those ADUs in Arlington, as well as working with the local CDC or other affordable housing advocates.
Yeah, so that was definitely something that people raised, and it's an important kind of issue and consideration generally. Where we came down was that imposing, there's a range of things. You could have it be full on, income restricted, following all the regulatory requirements. That's one option. You could restrict the rent as sort of another option, or do nothing, which is what we did. And we felt like imposing a full regulatory burden on an ordinary, homeowner is just that's not going to work. That's just going to kill the bylaw. And it'll be very, very few people who would take that regulatory burden and risk. So, we felt like the other thing to keep in mind is that these units are at most 900 square feet. For most housing, it's going to be much less than that. It can only be 50% the size of the principal dwelling. So these are, sort of naturally smaller, more affordable, less expensive, I should say, units. They're, the landlord is going to be the person, generally speaking, who lives there. It's mom and pop. It's often an intimate kind of thing. The person's living right, either separated by just a wall or, at most, a small amount of yard space. So we felt like it's really not a necessary component. Many people will maybe use the ADU for supplemental income. If you think about an empty nester who's on a fixed income, who wants to convert space to help, keep up with property taxes or other living expenses, we need the ADU to be able to pay for itself and support the homeowner. So that's why we didn't, as a general matter, want to impose it. And we explained that, in many settings to as many people as we could. But we did work with we have a CDC here in Arlington that is really great, the Housing Corporation of Arlington. And we met with their executive director multiple times and wanted to make sure that this bylaw would allow for the HCA to expand, use ADUs to expand their portfolio. And it turns out that this is something that they could add units at a very low cost per unit on a cost per unit basis compared to, a new development, where they, here they already own the land and they're just essentially converting space. So we did craft it around to ensure that it would work for HCA, but not impose a burden on other homeowners.
That's fantastic. I think one thing that's worth noting is, you are clearly speaking with a lot of legal knowledge. Talk a little bit about your role as an attorney and the support you were able to provide in your firm.
Sure. So I'm a real estate lawyer by training and by work, and so I had gotten just found out about Equitable Arlington. I wanted to sort of find out a way to sort of get involved, just as a resident and a citizen with promoting housing, and was able to connect with Equitable Arlington. And then my firm, Golson Stores, we just by work do a lot of zoning and permitting and entitlements work, and so we were able to, on a pro bono basis, support this project, which I thought was really great because it allowed us to approach it like a zoning amendment, both from a technical perspective for drafting and how to solve issues and challenges as they came up, how to draft a bylaw that was coherent and worked as a sort of technical matter, and also to sort of understand kind of the process, the political process and legislative process for zoning amendments and how to set them up in a way that allows them to be more successful, and how to how to think about engaging with and working with all the various stakeholders who are very valuable for the process and necessary to be successful.
That's great. Is there anything else you want to add from your perspective before we talk to Barbara about the ground game?
I guess the one other thing I realized I didn't mention is just housing choice and the role it played, which is I think a couple of ways. One, some of the things you have to we had to answer about ADUs was, first of all, like what size can they be, and other kind of restrictions. Do you have to have two entrances, et cetera. And housing choice provided a important and useful sort of framework that we could draw on to say this is the policy wisdom of the state, and a ton of work has gone into this, and we should follow that guidance, which we were able to do. The other thing it did was by lowering the threshold for passage from the previous 2/3 to 50%. I think it did, even though our bylaw wound up passing with nearly 80% of the town meetings, so we didn't quote unquote need housing choice in the end, it did allow us and all of the sort of stakeholders along the way to feel a little more empowered to think about this as good policy, as opposed to having a more defensive orientation where we felt like, well, we're going to need a super majority. We should be more cautious.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. We'll see you again in the Q&A. And now I'm going to turn over to Barbara Thornton to talk about the ground game.
Great.
And I apologize to everyone. I realize my cat is in this room. This is the reality of these virtual settings, and so she's been meowing, and I apologize if the speaker is picking that up. Barbara, appreciate you taking the time tonight. We wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of political process and the ground game of both what does the process look like in the town of Arlington to get a bylaw like this passed, but then really how did you and Equitable Arlington work to convince members of town meeting and other relevant bodies in town to pass this? And I think for the sake of all of our viewers, maybe it would be helpful if you could explain quickly sort of the political process or the steps necessary to sort of from having a drafted bylaw, getting it through the process, and ultimately in front of town meeting. Would you mind doing that briefly?
Sure. I just was trying to paste into chat an outline of what I was going to talk about, but that's not working. I'll try it again at the end. The way we're in a town, it's a Arlington is a town manager form of government with a 5-person select board and the other organizations that are pretty standard, but I think that's a little bit different from some of the audience. In order to, the legislative body for town government is the town meeting. So once a year we meet in April, and there are 252 town meeting members. And starting sometime in late fall, people start thinking about, is there anything on the warrant? I mean, is there anything that we want to add? Individuals or groups will think about that, putting together a warrant article. So putting together a warrant article is a very simple process. You just say, this is what I want to do, and you get 10 signatures standing in front of Trader Joe's, and then you take it in, file it with the clerk, and you're on the list. It becomes a little bit more complicated down the road as you have to refine it and make sure that the legal language fits in. And that was a really important part, I think, of the ground game success for us, because we stepped back and reached I think a very powerful and I hope an example of something that we will do as a town going forward for warrant article providers and boards like the redevelopment board to work together as colleagues to make sure that it sounds right. And that the language is right. One of the reasons that it failed before was because it didn't pass that test. So that was key.
So I'm curious about how you sort of approached the sort of lobbying, for lack of a better term, it's not lobbying, but approach the outreach and advocacy at each stage in the process, including with the Arlington Redevelopment Board, the ARB.
Yeah, try once more to punch this in. Control. Not working. Okay, so to make sure that it worked, the first thing that I'm just going to go through. I have 6 points.
Yeah, great.
To make sure that it worked.
Great.
And first one,
we can share your points also with the viewers after if you're having trouble with the chat.
Thanks. The first thing is, the first item is till the soil. If we didn't have Steve Revelak, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, putting together the website and the organization and the group of colleagues that is loosely named equitablearlington.org, and that's equitable-arlington.org, we wouldn't be anywhere. The next step was Ben Rudick came up to put together a Facebook group called Arlington Neighbors for More Neighbors. And through that, a group of like-minded, progressive, housing interested town residents came together, and over the occasional potluck dinner or just talking with each other when COVID landed on Zoom, and we would agree that what we saw in the town were, and what I think a lot of towns and cities see, is that the NIMBY interests just like default win the case so often, and because they say status quo, don't move it. What we did was we came to all of those public board meetings. We said, we've got to protect our professional staff, people like Jenny Raitt, who are up there trying to move the town forward, and we need to protect them from the NIMBY outrage that was there. So that was really important. The second thing that we did in preparing the warrant article, as Phil said, write the article that you want, that you believe in, that you're going to fight for. Don't allow in any poison pills because you think that's ultimately going to be where the compromise goes. Don't compromise until you have to. Write a good article. And I think we did that with Phil's help. Things like the blood relatives and the families, and he mentioned the poison pills. We met, once we got started, we met with every head of the buildings, of the key town departments, got to meet with the building department, the building inspector, got to meet with the fire chief. Phil has already told you how critically important and inspirational it was to meet with Jenny Raitt, the planning director. And we maintained a close relationship with them. We met one-on-one with the head of the ZB Zoning Board of Appeals. We met individually with every member of the redevelopment board. We met with select board members, and others who might end up meeting with their city councilors. Those individual discussions are really key. We identified common interests, and that's, if you're starting to work with ADUs, it's an easy issue because there's so many common issues. Seniors on fixed incomes, young couples that are trying to find a way to just make those mortgage payments happen on the house they just bought. The people in town that say, we want our school teachers to be able to live in our town, not to commute into our town. School teachers, municipal staff, etc. There are people who in town who want to see more affordable housing, and there are people in town who may not care about affordable housing, but they just don't want to see, just like 90% of the town, be single family homes on quarter-acre lots. So all of those were allies or potential allies. We just had to get out the message. And when we got, as we began to get the message out, we began to get more and more interest. In the next, now number 4 is counting the votes. You have to gather your potential allies and meet with the individual precincts. Our town has precinct meetings, individual precinct meetings, before the warrant articles come up, before town meeting starts, and thank people. I really hope that we walked away with a reputation for being firm and clear, and maybe not in the mainstream, but being honest and data driven and sincere in what we believed, and not to do any dirty tricks or tell any lies, and just to be gracious to people, even people who said, we just can't support you. Thank you for sharing your perspective. It's really important. We sent out, we learned about the opposition because and Steve got us started on this early. We counted the votes on comparable votes from prior years for all the town meeting members. And I had that chart, and I must have changed it, like daily, on where I thought people might come down and who could be influenced and who couldn't be influenced and what they needed to know. So that's all part of the counting your votes, is knowing your opposition. We sent targeted emails to people, and the 5th point is that we prepared database materials and visuals. I don't want to run all the time here. No. I'm delighted to leave my email with people. We have tons of really solid database material. The key sources are Assessor's Office, the American Planning Association, the AIA, and AARP, as Phil mentioned. And last is prepare for vote night. We had, I think it was 12 motions against us, bylaw amendment, or not bylaw amendments, warrant articles filed against us, or motions filed against us. All I can say for that is, like, stay hydrated, and that's all.
Great. Couple of questions. What were some of the concerns that you heard when you met with like the building inspector and other town departments? And just briefly, off the top of your head.
The building inspector was not in love with this idea. He had opposed it before, and I noticed that when he's a town meeting member, and when he voted, he abstained. He was the only abstention on the vote, I think. But he was straightforward and honest with us. He said, look, I don't know about ADUs, but I'm going to inspect this as if it were a 2-family house. And I'm going to inspect it tough because I don't want anybody dying on my watch. And that turned out to be, I mean, it was a little scary at first, but it turned out to be great because we could go out, people saying, oh, this isn't safe. We could say, this is the building inspector and this is his attitude toward it. And he's going to use a very conservative approach to building inspections. Inspectors all over the state use different standards, and there is a new building inspection law that is moving forward into the statutes in the next couple of years. But for right now, there is nothing specific for ADUs. So he had considerable discretion and he was going to be tough. And that was protective for us, I think.
Great. I wanted to talk also about a little bit of how you contested some of the opposition. I want to share this document. I know you keep giving Phil the credit for writing it, but I want folks to be able to see this very detailed document, and we'll share this with participants after the fact. But can you talk a little bit about what the purpose of this was and what went into writing it?
Well, as I said, I think that what is important in when you prepare your case, when you prepare your ground game, is you go forward with information that is general. It's not your opinion. It's not your belief. It's what it's as fact-based as you can get it. So it was wonderful to have Phil on the team and say, you know, he's got footnotes. We covered the issues. We were very specific about what we were proposing. And that, I think, was the first and the best of maybe 15 or 20 different submissions that we put out there for different audiences.
Great. And the reaction to it, or how did people respond?
People responded, well, we got this out pretty early. So this was very basic. As more people in town thought about ADUs and had questions about ADUs, more questions came up. So we have much longer versions that deal with specific questions like the specifics on parking and what it might mean and why did we take that position. But I think this one was the mother of all fact sheets.
Mm. That's great. And as I said, we'll Barbara and the team have said we can share this with folks on the call. So we will distribute it by email after the fact. It looks like it'll be a very useful tool for those who are trying to do similar in their own communities. I am just going to try to pull up my notes here again. I apologize. I know Representative Vargas is trying to call in, but he's in his car leaving the State House now, so we're having a little bit of difficulty. Barbara, I think one other thing about some of that public outreach that you guys did. I know you talked about meeting with every, various town departments, with every precinct prior to town meeting, certainly the ARB. But I know you guys did some op-eds in the local newspaper and some online outreach. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, newspapers, particularly in smaller towns like ours, are love copy. And so it's really easy if you are, if you're an honest broker and they trust that you're not playing them, to just say, can I write something? Can I give you 750 words on ADUs by Monday? And they say, no, it has to be by Sunday night. And that's the kind of negotiation that we had. And they were very helpful. And then the other side would come back. And at one point, it was, as one of my colleagues said, it's like the war of the grandmothers, because one of our biggest, I'm a grandmother, and one of the biggest oppositions was from another grandmother, who always slammed back in the lists, the Arlington list, which is like a neighborhood group for the town. or the town print paper or the town online news.
Great.
But it's easy and it's essential.
Yep, fantastic. And then just one final thing, just personal relationships. I think when we had a meeting last week, one of the things that Phil said is that you, Barbara, have leaned on personal relationships that you've had in town for many years. Can you just talk a little bit about that? It's just the power of personal relationships.
I'm not sure exactly what Phil meant by that. I think what he meant was I'm old. I've been here a long time. I've been here for 30 years, but I think that what came out of it was less the personal relationships than, and I've been in town and I've been in town organizations, and so I know a little bit, I know probably a lot about how the town works and to respect the municipal government process, which I think is really key if you're going to do this. Municipal government officials are your friends. They may not be out carrying the banner, but they're your friends, and respect them. People came up to me. I mean, if you build this as a big tent, which we really tried to do, people will come up that I've never met before and talk to me, share stories, share fears, share wishes. So,
well, I think an important takeaway is that you living in our communities, we get to know people through various means, and not just through our housing activism, and the importance of really, trying to utilize those relationships.
I know I did have one. Maybe this is what he was talking about. We decided that we in Arlington at town meeting under Zoom, you can't like present your warrant article at the front of the room. You have to present a video. And so we did a video where I talked as the senior citizen, and then I found a guy in the neighborhood who was very interested in this, and he talked as a new homeowner with a young family who happened to have built an ADU-like thing for his mother to live with them and how much it meant to him. And it turned out that he had gone to school with my son in high school in Arlington. So maybe that's it. But that was so, I think that was so important to have this wonderful young man talk about being in the house, how important it was for his mother to live there, helping their kids. And then when she tripped one time he saw her out the window and was able to go right there. So it's good for her. ADUs are wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Barbara. We're going to turn for a couple minutes over to Steve Revlak, and then we'll have you back on when we get to Q&A. I see that Representative Vargas has joined us. Representative, we'll have you jump on in just a minute. You can keep your video and audio off now for a few minutes. Steve, go ahead and turn your camera on. We're going to talk with Steve about, and it's similar to Barbara, but the importance of activists, and in particular, as Barbara gave you a lot of credit for, you're one of the driving forces behind Equitable Arlington. We as Abundant Housing are dedicated to helping build the capacity of pro-housing organizations like your own and help create new organizations. So I think it'll be useful for our audience to understand really what's the role of having a group like yours exist in Arlington to help get this passed. And a little bit on sort of the background of the organization, I think would be a useful frame to start.
Okay, I'll start with a little bit about the background of the organization. We started in 2019. At the time, there was a proposal for a warrant article that would have allowed more multifamily and more mixed-use construction along, the main corridors in Arlington, which are Massachusetts Avenue and Broadway. And I supported this. I went out to bat for it at precinct meetings and during the hearings for it. But in the process of this, I discovered a couple of other people who felt the same way. And basically we found, working on a warrant article campaign, for lack of a better word, it allowed us to find each other. The name Equitable Arlington came up because I decided that I needed a website to post some stuff on, and that was the name I picked at the time, and it's just kind of stuck. But having a group, an advocacy group, I think is incredibly important. There is a piece of research, a paper called "Who Participates in Local Government." The authors were Katie Einstein, Max Palmer, and a third author named Glick, whose first name is escaping me at the moment. But
David, I believe.
yeah, they basically took public meeting minutes from around Metro Boston, and basically built a database of who came to comment on to planning and zoning boards about housing proposals. This later became a book, Neighborhood Defenders. But one of the things you realize about their research showed that the people who show up at these meetings they tend to be older, they tend to be whiter, they tend to be long-term residents, and they tend to be organized. So having an organization an effective way to countering that is also to be organized support, as a to sort of offset organized opposition. Aside from politics, any political campaign is tribal in a sense, where if you are, you might not have strong feelings about an issue, but 2 or 3 people, and if you see that they support it, well, then you might support it too. So having but anyway, if having a variety of people, voicing support in different forums is a way to make people more comfortable about it. And for just a lot of these things, you could think of, there's 20% of the people, 20% of town meeting that's going to love what you're doing and is going to vote yes. There's 20% of the people that absolutely hate it and will vote no, and there's no way you're going to change their minds. What you're really trying to do is to get to that 60% in the middle. And there's being able to just answer questions and be honest, and having people to share the work of doing that it's just tremendously helpful.
Thank you. Is there anything, I sort of let the other two go a little longer because I wasn't sure about Representative Vargas. He is here, and I want to make sure we fit him in as well as some Q&A. But so I don't want to cut you short though, Steve. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of the specific role that Equitable Arlington played in advocating for the ADU, in addition to anything that Barbara or Phil shared?
So this isn't Equitable Arlington specific. This is more about, the one thing I would like to say has more to do with political campaigns in general, especially when you're dealing with an organized opposition. Because if it's the first time you do it, it can be overwhelming. Sometimes things get vitriolic. Sometimes there will inevitably be lots of personal attacks. And after a couple of nights of this, you'll realize that your opponents are just saying the same thing over and over again. And you realize that you just have to have, a counter story and say the same thing over and over again. You're not trying to win an argument, you're trying to build support. And once you realize that, it becomes a lot easier.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Steve. And I apologize again for cutting you short. And hopefully we'll have some good questions we can have you jump in on. But I appreciate it. I'm going to turn over to Representative Vargas, who is, I believe, calling in. So he won't have video. I'm pretty sure. Can you hear me, Representative?
Yes, I can. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. If anyone in the audience can't hear, just send it in the chat. But we're going to proceed assuming that everyone can hear you. So we've been talking for the last 45 minutes or so about this ADU bylaw in Arlington and the great way that Equitable Arlington drafted it, advocated for it, fought the opposition, and won its passage. And what we're trying to do is encourage pro-housing folks around the state to take on similar battles or efforts in their own communities. But that's necessary because although ADUs are such an important tool for communities around the state, they're not necessarily given any deference under Mass General Law that governs zoning in Massachusetts. You, Representative Vargas, are the primary sponsor, along with Representative Honan in Boston, of H 1448, which is a whole suite of zoning reform initiatives that includes ADUs. I was wondering if you could just start off by telling us about the bill and sort of what the key portions of it are that you want pro-housing folks around the state to be aware of, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ADU piece.
Sure. Thanks, Jesse, and thank you guys for accommodating me here. I apologize that the session dragged on a bit as we mandated vaccine requirements in the House of Representatives. The Republicans raised the stink about it, so we were in session a little bit longer, and so I apologize about that. And also congratulations to the folks in Arlington for organizing and getting that done. I was a city councilor in Haverhill, and I know how challenging those meetings can be. And so just hearing some of the stories that were just shared, kudos to you for sticking to it and organizing to make it happen. You guys have some great reps from Arlington, and it's wonderful to work with them. H 1448, an act relative to housing production, does several things. One of the things that it does is that it allows ADUs by right in every municipality. And by the way, before I go forward on just talking about some of the other things that are in the bill, this may have come up in the discussion already, but one of the other arguments for ADUs that we've been hearing a little bit more from, especially now, is that they can help alleviate the workforce shortages that we're seeing in many of our cities and towns. Many small businesses aren't able to find people to work because people can't afford to work in the communities that they live in. And so ADUs can often be seen as a solution to provide housing to that workforce so that they can actually live nearby these small businesses that are struggling to hire folks right now. So it is also a workforce issue, in addition to a housing stability and accessibility and affordability issue as well.
That's a great point.
The bill also sets a statewide affordable housing goal, production goal. You don't value what you don't measure. So we have to measure, what our goal is and how we're doing. We don't have a statewide affordable housing production goal. It also requires multifamily zoning around more public transportation. In the last bill that we did, we had said that all MBTA stations have to have a multifamily zone around it for transit-oriented development, but we want to expand that to include regional transit authorities as well. In the bill, we also are allowing inclusionary zoning bylaws to be enacted with a simple majority vote. You may recall that last session we did change several votes to a simple majority vote, but inclusionary zoning bylaws were not one of them. And so we want to make sure that we can do that. And we also are trying to take a look at how underutilized commercial properties can be used for housing. So during this pandemic, obviously, there's been a downturn in commercial property, but the housing need continues. And so how can we creatively convert commercial property into housing in areas that it really makes sense? And then lastly, we want to make sure we're prioritizing state-owned land for affordable housing. And so this bill also ensures that we're providing opportunities for affordable housing on state-owned land, particularly surplus state-owned land. So I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic. I think one question, I'm sure that a lot of people in this webinar know about housing choice being passed, and you mentioned it as well. But why is there still a need for further zoning reform? And you already addressed this a little bit, but can you expand on why do we need to continue thinking about state approaches to zoning reform, despite the fact that housing choice and the MBTA communities portion passed earlier this year?
Yeah, I mean, look, housing isn't one of those issues where you could say, well, we did that last session, so, we're not going to come back to that. I think every single session, there's going to be a need for us to pass some sort of housing legislation to further spur production, to make it easier for municipalities to produce more housing, and to provide opportunities for more people to weigh in on the development process at the local level. So there are things we can do at the state to make it easier for change to happen at the local level. Ultimately, I still believe municipalities have the greatest tools in their toolbox, but the least we can do at the state level is to make sure that we're making the rules easier, we're putting the funding where it needs to be, and that we continue to advance housing production and to incentivize it in a manner that's effective. So there's so much more that we have to do, and that's not even touching on, modernizing, code for the new construction materials that are available, hitting sustainability goals. There's so much we have to do on housing, and the only way we really get it done is the same model as to how we got housing production done. When you have both inside movement, legislators, of course, dedicated to it, but you really have a movement of organizers and organizations and coalitions working together to press the legislature and the governor to get something done, and we need that again.
So I think that's a great entree to another question I have for you is, what can we as members of abundant housing, as pro-housing activists around the state do to help ensure that this bill does pass it in this session? What do you need from us?
Great question. Yeah, so I would say, there's still time for any legislator to sign on and co-sponsor our bill. So the more co-sponsors we get, the more we get to say that, hey, this is really a priority for the membership. If we get above 81 co-sponsors, that means that we literally have the votes already before it even gets to the floor. So hitting up your representatives and asking them to sign on, and advocating to the committee as well, sharing your stories with the housing committee is effective.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Representative. If you don't mind sticking around for a couple minutes, we're going to open it up for questions to the audience, questions either about the Arlington ADU bylaw and the process that Equitable Arlington went through to win its passage, or to the bill that the representative was just talking about. Steve, Barbara, and Phil, you can jump back on video. Folks can, I've seen a couple questions come through the chat. I think folks can also use the Q&A feature. Might be a little bit easier to monitor. But I've already seen, just want to make sure I get out. So question, so from Morgan, Phil mentioned pro ADU bylaws typically only result in single-digit units per town. Why is this the case, and what's the biggest barrier? And does anyone have recommendations for appropriate incentives from the state or municipalities for the development of ADUs statewide? So that's the second piece. Let's start with the first one. Do you know why that's the barrier, or what is the biggest barrier to ADU production, Phil, or anyone?
I mean, I think it has to do with that there are a lot of regulatory restrictions and zoning, restrictions. So it's often very difficult and illegal. It's expensive upfront to do. I think a lot of people will view this as sort of a pain. So we actually, in going around town meeting, had met someone who bought a house that had an old, ADU from sort of pre-zoning days, and the first thing they did when they bought the house was take it out. You're talking about, a quote unquote normal person. This is not a housing developer adding a housing unit to their lot, so that may take away some of their yard, or otherwise just have this tenant now they need to deal with. I also just think about it like solar panels, which are really necessary for sort of like, all the environmental reasons. They're a great economic investment, and yet they're not on like every single roof in Massachusetts. And it's like, why is that? And it's like, well, because this is a big home improvement project you have to do. So I think, what we did was in Arlington was allow ADUs to sort of the current, dimensional requirements of zoning. But I think the question, it's a little embedded in the question, I think is, and I agree, is to sort of really incentivize this as like an affirmative good that we want a lot more of, to really loosen rules more, make them more permissive if you're doing an ADU, and provide, financial, financial benefits, or financial incentive and capability and know-how. I mean, I think it would be great if there were an industry that could be built up. So it's like, oh, I'd like to do an ADU. Okay, well, here are architects and designers and contractors who do ADUs and can make it very simple. I think similar, I mean, the solar analogy in my mind is similar. in terms of a complicated project at your house, where now we have, and there are a number of incentives to do it, and we have an industry built up around to sort of explain how it all works.
Yeah, Barbara.
Can I just jump in? I
Absolutely.
think that people who are in the process of writing the ADU bylaw or warrant and trying to get it passed forget that this is not just a public policy issue. We have it in our heads. This is a great public policy issue. It is a private homeowner family decision to lay out $100,000. And if they think that the public is going to step in and say, well, you've had it for 3 years, but you rented to somebody who's not a blood relative, so you're going to have to tear it out, they're not going to do it. And there are enough poison pills in the bills around the state. And I just want to do a shout out to Amy Dane, who's looked at everything in the state. There's enough poison pills out there in the existing legislation that stop it. If we have better ADU laws, we'll see more ADUs.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. A second part of the question, and I think this may be good to have an answer from Representative Vargas on this. Does anyone have recommendations for appropriate incentives, so from the state or from municipalities, for the development of ADUs statewide? And I might add to that question why, Representative Vargas, is important in your bill that ADUs are allowed by right across the state rather than through special permit or other means.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole intent of the bill, is to make sure that there's a standard statewide, and so there's not this hodgepodge of, certain communities welcome it, others don't. And I think, to the question around state incentives, I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind for me, but I certainly would think that two of the barriers have already been mentioned. One of them is financial. Is there an opportunity to provide either very low, interest loans or no interest loans to help folks create ADUs? But I also think there's just a matter of education. Most people don't know what ADUs are and that they can create them. And so I think, or that they can apply to potentially create them. And so I think there's an education process that has to also be undergone.
Yeah, thank you. I would add, I know there was a discussion couple years ago in Somerville around potentially creating, I think it was Somerville, some sort of loan program, low interest loan program to help people pay for the creation of accessory dwelling units, but then it would be restricted to income by income and rent levels as well as allowed under state law. So I think that gets back to some of the conversation we had with Phil earlier around, how does that actually cover the cost of building an accessory unit? But I know, at least I believe it was Somerville, it's been part of the conversation. I think there was another question that came through the chat. This is for the Equitable Arlington folks. Why did you go with a citizen petition? In our town, zoning bylaws come from the planning department. Is citizen petition the normal path for changes in Arlington? Go ahead, Steve.
So yeah, it's funny. In Arlington, citizen petitions are actually quite common, but historically they've generally been of the flavor of, making it more difficult to build stuff. Yeah, our planning department and our redevelopment board have done some, have put forward some really great ideas in the past. I think the advantage of going with a citizen petition in this case was that, basically we owned the article, and rather than a board that's effectively trying to serve a large population that instead of them having to balance very negative competing interests and basically watering the thing down, we were able to kind of stick to our guns we were basically, it gave us a little more freedom to, I think, propose a better piece of legislation.
Yeah, and I would add to it that under Massachusetts general law, in the 350 cities and towns that are not Boston, the citizen petition process exists, and it is available, regardless of whether your form of government is town meeting, a strong mayor, whatever it may be, with 10 registered voters in the town. So even if it's not a common process in your community, it does actually exist. And in every community, Boston is governed by slightly different rules, but one single individual can bring a zoning petition to the zoning commission in the city of Boston. So rather than needing even 10 registered voters in Boston, you can do it with one. So I would just add that note. We have another question from Aaron. Says, would it be possible to create a handful of pre-approved plans for ADUs that could be used to reduce the design and planning costs for creating them? Does anyone want to answer that? It's a good question.
I'll jump in as
Go for it.
the city planner working with architects. Yes, that's a great idea, and I hope that I know that because I checked with our attorney today, the state has not yet certified our warrant article for ADUs. When it is certified, I'm hoping that we will be able to work with the building inspections department and prepare some guidelines, or that they will prepare some guidelines. We've given them some drafts for this, of how to go about doing it. So it goes to the interested homeowner, that basically says it's not hard, but this is what you have to do. These are the steps. On top of that, it is very possible, and AIA has plans. There are 3 different basic kinds of ADUs. AIA and others have plans out there. More and more people are getting involved in this. It is going to be a nationwide issue. So,
yeah, thank you. Anything else to add to that question from anyone? Great. I'll give a final call for questions. I don't believe there's anything more in the chat or the Q&A, but going once, going twice. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us tonight. I particularly want to thank Representative Vargas for jumping on despite the challenges he was facing at the State House, and definitely want to thank Barbara, Steve, and Phil from Equitable Arlington for sharing their knowledge and experience. Again, if folks participating in this call are interested in participating in more conversations like this, I certainly encourage you to join as an Abundant Housing member. The link was shared earlier, abundanthousinggma.org. And we're definitely open to suggestions from the public at large around other learning opportunities like this. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time. Oh, I'll also add, we have recorded this and we'll make it available on our website and social media. And we'll email everyone who registered for this event. I know a number of folks, it looks like we're not able to make it. So thank everyone for taking the time to join us tonight, and look forward to having another great conversation like this soon. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jesse. Take care, everybody.